All right, question number 3. So we're going to assume that the United States economy is in a recession and in short-run equilibrium. Draw a correctly labeled graph of the short-run and long-run Phillips curves and use letter A to label the point that could represent the current state of the recession. So if we look over at the rubric, that's my old question. Let's get the right document here. We will see that the long-run Phillips curve should be intersecting at a place that would represent full employment. And then because the economy is in a recession, we would also see a point to the right of the long-run and short-run intersection. So just remember recession to the right. So you're going to get 1 point for doing a correctly labeled graph of the short-run Phillips curve, and then another point for putting point A in the correct location. Going back to it, now we have to label this on the aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph, which I think, again, is something I've told you guys before, is something that all of you are super capable of, and I think that that is totally within your skill level. At this point, you're going to make a beautiful graph, and it is going to look something like this, where we have the YE and PLE on the left of the long run aggregate supply, and we're going to get 1 point for putting YE and PLE on the inside of the long run aggregate supply, and another point for putting the YF on the long run to the right. Now I know this graph is showing aggregate demand shift, and that is because of what is next. So what is next here? It says to balance the federal budget, the federal government decides to raise income taxes, which is a contractionary tool, while maintaining the current level of spending. So if you think about that, I don't know if the budget is balanced in this economy, but clearly, even if it was, we'd be moving towards deficit. If we had a surplus, maybe we wouldn't actually hit a deficit, but we're certainly moving towards that direction. So if we're going to raise income taxes while maintaining the level of spending that we currently have, this is going to reduce aggregate demand. And you can see that shift to the left with aggregate demand. And we had to label that Y2 and PL2. And you're going to get 1 point for putting that line in the correct location. So it doesn't really matter how far you move it, but it should be to the left. All right. So now we're bringing in some Federal Reserve stuff, which is fun. And we've got the Federal Reserve that's going to try to intervene and use monetary policy to stimulate the economy. What open market operation or policy should the Federal Reserve implement? Well, open market specifically means the buying and selling of bonds. If we want to stimulate the economy, we want the money supply to increase. So that means we must be buying bonds. So you're going to get 1 point for buying the bonds. Now, it says, using a correctly labeled graph of the money market, show how the policy in D1 affects nominal interest rates. So if we look at the rubric, we are looking for a money market graph with the line shifting to the right, and that is the buying of bonds. Double check your labels. Make sure you have nominal interest rate labeled at the top, the quantity of money, and that we're shifting this to the right. And you have both money supply lines labeled, you've got both quantities labeled, and both interest rates. And you know, like we've talked about in class, obviously these labels might differ a little. That's okay, so long as they're labels that make sense with what this graph is for and that they're consistent throughout. The last part of this little monetary policy section is about what will the impact be of the policy on the price level. So now you have to think about, well, if they're going to buy bonds, it's going to make interest rates go lower. That means aggregate demand is going to shift to the right. So we should be looking for a higher price level. So if you look at the description here, this whole section on monetary policy is 4 points, which, you know, this is all of Unit 4. They're trying to assess, do you understand the concepts from Unit 4? 1 point is earned, that price level will increase, and it's because interest sensitive spending, which means investment in consumption, C and IG, is going to increase. And that's a part of aggregate demand, and that's going to shift to the right, and that would increase price level. We didn't have to graph that, but you might want to graph it somewhere on your scrap paper to determine the answer. Lastly, part E, now assume that the government and the Fed take no action. So like I've told you in the past, this concept of no action is a common follow-up to all these different things, fiscal and monetary, try them out, what could happen. All right, let's pretend we're an Adam Smith classical economist and we don't want to do any sort of government intervention. So in the long run, will the short run aggregate supply increase, decrease, or remain unchanged? And what will happen to the rate of natural rate of unemployment? Well, we know that the answer to part 2 is that there's going to be no change. And there's no explain here written on the end or at the beginning. So I'm just going to leave no change as the answer. Let's go back to part 1. Let's think about this. Go back up to your original rubric or your original graph. If this economy is left alone to do nothing, what's going to occur? Well, the price level is lower than it should be because we're in a recession. So because price level is lower, if you think about it, this short run aggregate supply would probably shift to the right. And it would also shift to the right if we were talking about starting from here. So either way, whether we're talking from the original point or the new point, we're going to be shifting to the right. I know it's not the new point though, because that came from an increase in taxes. So, just in case you were wondering about why, which point to start from, some of you might make the mistake of looking at the new point that resulted from the tax increase. But the question says, imagine if there's no Federal Reserve and the government did not take any policy actions. So that's the fiscal and the monetary. So the cool thing about this question is that if you made that mistake, you'd still get it right. Because the short run aggregate supply is going to shift to the right regardless of which point you would start with. So you will notice that the answer gives you 2 points, and the short run aggregate supply will increase because wages and other inputs decrease. So that's 1 point right there, the identification and the explanation. And then the last part we already talked about. So total, this question is 11 points, which is pretty representative of what you're going to find for a question number 1 on your FRQs. So that is question 3. That's all.